My name is Gethyn Ellis and I'd like to welcome you to my talk, Pay Less, Get More, a Guide to SQL Server Licensing. Hopefully in this talk I'll be able to give you some useful bits of information about how you can really get the most out of your SQL Server investment. But first, just a couple of words around PASS. PASS has been really influential in my career over the last 20 years, from all the free training events and the SQL Saturdays and the user groups that they put on. I've been able to attend and now speak at and deliver presentations at. So do check out the website pass.org, and I'd encourage you to attend your local user group and a PASS SQL Saturday in your area as well when they get going again. But there's some really interesting free training on there that you can make the most of and really help develop your career. Learning from people who are prepared to share their knowledge with you. You can get some really good training from industry experts. And also, please fill in your session evaluation. It's really important to the organisers to help them get feedback on the event, and it's really important to me as well for my session, so I can develop and improve it going forward. And if you get your feedback in before Friday the 20th of November, 5 p.m. Eastern Time, you will be entered into a draw to win a prize. To leave your feedback, there is a link in the left-hand side navigation bar. Click the link, leave your feedback, and if you do it before 5 p.m. on Friday, the 20th of November, you might win a prize as well. So let me give you a little bit of information about me. I've been working with SQL Server for about 20 years, and in that time I've had a variety of different jobs, from report writer, web developer and database administrator. Now for the last 12 years I've been running a small consulting and training business, GethynEllis.com, and lately we've partnered with our good friends at Widen to offer cost-effective end-to-end solutions in areas like data platform architecture and design, including high availability and disaster recovery solutions, and obviously how our clients would need to license those. We do a lot of SQL Server migration, so whether that's upgrading to a newer version on premises or migrating to Azure Cloud, be it Azure SQL Database or running SQL Server on Azure VM. We do health checks and performance tune-ups for our customers as well, and we offer a range of training based around the Microsoft official curriculum, the Microsoft data platform and the Azure platform as well. Feel free to follow me on Twitter. I am at Gethyn_Ellis. I do follow back, and please do connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm much more active on LinkedIn than I am on other social media platforms like Twitter, but you can follow either way. If you've got any questions about what I talk about in the session today, please do drop me an email. My email address is gethyn@gethynellis.com. Any questions at all, please do get in touch. Okay, so let's talk briefly about what we're going to cover in the session today. This presentation is focused on SQL Server licensing. When I talk to clients and speak to clients and customers, there's a theme that emerges around licensing. It's a bit of a minefield. What you can do, what you can't do. Do you need software assurance? What does SA actually give me? And hopefully we'll address some of these in this presentation today. So we'll be covering things such as, what SQL Server editions do you need to license? SQL Server and software assurance, why I think you might need both. We look at the different types of licensing models you can use. So we look at core-based and we look at Server plus Cal. We'll discuss how you can license SQL Server in a virtual environment, and we'll look at different licensing scenarios and what you can do in those situations to help potentially make some savings on your licensing costs. Now, there's no doubt about it, SQL Server is expensive. Well, it's not cheap, and getting your architecture wrong can lead to a very costly licensing bill. So hopefully, as we go through this talk, we'll make SQL Server licensing more clear to you and show what actions you can take to make some savings on your licenses. And ultimately it boils down to answering a few questions, such as, which editions of SQL Server do you really need? What is the workload and resource usage around your SQL Server? How many users do you have, and can you actively count those users? And are you going to be migrating to a cloud platform anytime soon? And hopefully we'll answer some of those questions as we make our way through the talk today. Now I'm going to tell you a bit of a story, and it is a story. These are fictitious characters with fictitious companies, but they've all been, the story's been formed in my head around some of my experiences with some of my customers. So I'm going to tell you about Chelsea. Chelsea was the new CEO of a brewery called Old Brewery. Now, Old Brewery had been around for about 100 years, but it was getting some pretty stiff competition from microbreweries and real ale producing cool cats, right? And this company in particular, its main competition, Cat's Brew, was now one of its closest rivals. It was established in the early 2000s and it got a real foothold in the marketplace. Now, the people at Cat Brew, they were cool cats. Everything they did seemed to work. Chelsea, when chatting with other CEOs at an industry conference, had discovered that they were using data and analytics to make decisions. Now, she didn't quite know what they were doing or how they were doing it, so she decided to do some investigations of her own so Old Brewery could potentially follow suit and take advantage of their data. Now, when Chelsea had reviewed the business budget, she was concerned that software licensing and SQL Server on its own was costing the company over £500,000, and she didn't really know what she was getting for that spend. She couldn't see how Old Brewery was getting a return on that investment, but she was sure it was this area that Cat Brew had held the upper hand and were using this investment to their advantage. Wanting more details but not sure what to do next, Chelsea did what all good senior managers do in that situation. She arranged a meeting. So Chelsea called a meeting of some of the key people in her department that she thought would be able to help her. She knew that she needed to change things up, but she didn't quite know how. So she invited to the meeting the architect Andrew, Deborah the DBA, the IT manager Mark, and obviously herself, Chelsea the CEO. Now, the meeting agenda was a series of questions that the CEO wanted answering. Why does our SQL Server licensing cost so much? What's our return investment on the software licensing, and how can we get more bang for our buck? How can we better utilise what we have to drive business growth? And what is it Cat Brew are doing so well that we can learn from? So at the meeting, Chelsea gave a brief introduction that she thought that Old Brewery needed to change. Its competition appeared more agile, appeared to be able to deliver to customers in areas that Old Brewery had previously struggled. She explained she thought the answer was in technology and in data in particular, but she needed help from the team. Old Brewery was spending a lot on SQL Server licensing, but were they getting enough return on investment? And then Chelsea opened up the discussion to the floor. Now, the IT manager Mark explained that Old Brewery's key business applications, marketing, point of sale applications, website, stock control, the CRM system and finance were all run on SQL servers and had been for a very long time. Now, most of the products were sort of off-the-shelf COTS products, and when implementing, Old Brewery had followed the recommendations from each of the suppliers around how the SQL Server was set up and configured. Andrew, the architect, said several years ago they made a decision that all infrastructure would run on virtual machines, and the decision at the time was to license for maximum virtualization to give Old Brewery full flexibility in their estate. And Andrew explained there are 3 hosts, 2 in the production data center and 1 in the DR site, with all the cores licensed, giving a total of 96 cores that had a license. Now, Deborah, the senior DBA, explained that the existing SQL Server infrastructure, she explained all around it. She said the business had a high availability and disaster recovery need, and they were using SQL Server availability groups to address that. And availability groups were being used on all 5 of the production SQL Server instances, and also in 5 of the UAT servers as well. And the reason the availability groups were in UAT is they wanted to match production. The SQL servers were starting to age, though. They were starting to get old. They were still on SQL Server 2012. Now, as Deborah was the only person that had a really good knowledge of SQL Server, and the only person with the in-house skills to upgrade the servers, but like lots of DBAs who are DBAs on their own, the only DBA in the business, she had lots of other work too. So making time to do these upgrades was not always easy and straightforward. She was busy making sure that the data warehouse was running and day-to-day production issues were dealt with, ensuring management got their crucial management reports. Now, Deborah mentioned in the meeting that newer versions of SQL Server could potentially help the organisation make better use of its data, allow them to make data-driven decisions, either through the use of Azure-based cloud, the Azure-based cloud and the data platform there, or perhaps even an on-premises implementation. And Chelsea, the CEO, was keen to learn more about this, as Cat Brew seemed to have this in their favour when it came to reacting to marketing demands and making changes. So Chelsea agreed that an upgrade might be needed, but she wanted to get a handle on licensing first. And as Deborah didn't have a lot of spare time, they would engage a consultant to help them better understand the licensing position. And this is where I enter the story. They engaged me in my consultancy to come and give them some advice at Old Brewery around the licensing position, and it was clear to me after the explanation that whilst they had a really good handle on SQL Server and all the features of it, no one really owned the licensing position. Okay, now it's likely they are more than covered by their existing licenses. They might actually be in a position to save money if they simply license their estate a little differently. All right, but licensing for Old Brewery has become the elephant in the room. People didn't like to talk about it, but with the new CEO, Chelsea, that's about to change, and they're going to own that position and they're going to get the most out of their investment. So to get the most out of SQL Server licensing, someone really needs to own that position and ask questions around the requirements and why you're doing things a certain way. So let's just review Old Brewery's current licensing position. They've got 3 hosts that are fully licensed. That's 96 cores in total. Right, there's 32 cores in each host. They've got 18 virtual machines running across 3 hosts, and the current licensing fee is just over £500,000. So what can we do to either perhaps reduce the cost or make sure they're getting the most out of their investment? And it's also worth noting at this stage they don't currently have software assurance either. So how much can you save? All right, now I'm from a DBA background, and when I'm delivering DBA training, I always make a joke that DBA stands for don't bother asking. You know the answer. It's either a straight no or it depends. Right, now the answer to the question how much can you save is an it depends answer. It's going to depend on your workload. It's going to depend on the addition of SQL Server you're using and the features you're using as well, along with your current utilization. So what we've got on the screen here are a couple of other examples where we have potentially saved customers money on their licensing costs. Now, going back to Old Brewery, it would probably be pretty easy to shave off around 63% of their existing licensing position. But there are some other examples here. So for a financial body, we managed to get their licensing bill down from 94,000 to 51,000, which is a significant saving of around £40,000. For a household retailer, we managed to reduce the licensing cost from 164,000 down to around about 50,000. So that's a massive saving of 114,000. And how we managed to achieve that, we will discuss later. But what we're going to talk about first is what we actually need to pay for and how we can structure our bill. So let's start by answering the question, what SQL Server editions need a license? The answer is all of them, but there are only a couple of editions that you have to pay for that license. So SQL Server is offered in 2 main editions, and these require a license that costs you money. Their Enterprise Edition, which is ideal for those mission critical applications that need mission critical performance and security and the plethora of high availability features that come with SQL Server. But don't forget, Standard Edition does deliver a fully featured database capability too, and the Microsoft marketing suggests that it's ended at mid-tier applications and data marts. My kind of view on it is if you're not using an Enterprise Edition feature, then there's no point paying for an Enterprise Edition license. So Standard Edition can really be useful. So it's these 2 editions that require a paid-for license. They're the ones that are going to cost you money. Okay, and there are some editions such as Express or Developer Edition where you don't need a license. Well, actually you do need a license, but the license is free. Okay, you don't need to pay for it. Now, Express Edition is free to distribute. It's a cut down version of SQL Server, and it's got some quite hard limitations around resources it can use. Developer Edition is basically Enterprise Edition, except you're not allowed to use it in production environments. Now, until reasonably recently, around about 2016, there was a small cost for Developer Edition. It was around $50 per user. But since 2016, Microsoft have made SQL Server Developer Edition free, and we're going to talk more about how you can use Developer Edition and how you can use it how you can use it to help you save money later on in the talk. Microsoft offer a couple of licensing options. So there's Server plus Cal and per core. Server plus Cal is only available in Standard Edition. So when you're licensing Server plus Cal, it gives you the option to license the server and then buy client access licenses for users and devices. And this can be quite cost effective when the number of users and devices is low and you can actually count them and limit them. If you're unable to count the number of users, or you need the premium database features of Enterprise Edition, then core-based licensing model is the one you're going to have to use. So core-based licensing, it gives SQL Server users a more precise measure of the computing power and a more consistent licensing metric, regardless of whether the solutions are deployed on physical on-premises servers, or if they're on virtual machines, or if they're in a cloud environment. Now, the different editions have different licensing models tailored to them. As I've said, Enterprise Edition must be licensed on the per core model. You license all the cores on the machine that SQL Server is running on. And then with Standard Edition, you have the choice of using a per core licensing model, or you can use Server plus Cal. And as I said, the choice is going to depend on the number of users, whether you can count them, the actual number of users and devices that they're going to need to connect. If the number of users is small, then Server plus Cal can be efficient, but it can quickly escalate, in which case the core model can be the cost effective way of licensing your SQL Server machines. So once you have decided whether you're going to go per core or Server plus Cal, you then have to make a decision around whether you're going to license individual machines, or if you're going to license for virtualization. When it comes to licensing individual machines, you can obviously license using the per core model, and when you're running a SQL Server on a physical machine, all the physical cores on that server need a license, and there is a minimum of a 4-core license needed for each server. So some of you might be wondering why Mr. Fox of Peppa Pig fame is included in my slide deck. Well, like Mr. Fox, and like Mr. Fox would sell them to you from the back of his van, SQL Server core licenses get sold in packs of 2. So that's a minimum. You need 2 packs of 2 core licenses. You can license at the individual machine level using Server plus Cal, and when you're taking this approach, you're going to be using SQL Server Standard Edition, and you can run it under the Server plus Cal model, where you buy a license or a server license for each server, and then you acquire a client access license, or a CAL, for each device or user that is going to be accessing the SQL Server or any of its components. So just remember, a CAL is not software, it's just a license granting users and devices access to the SQL Server. So you can license individual machines, but then you introduce the concept of virtualization, and virtualization adds to the licensing complexity a little bit. All right, so with a virtual SQL Server, you can still license the individual VM, and that would work in a very similar way to licensing a physical server that I just described, or I described on the previous slide, or you can license for maximum virtualization. Now, it might be that maximum virtualization might be more cost effective if you're working in a highly virtualized environment with lots of VMs. Right, so much like old Brewery have done, or followed a similar route to maximum virtualization. With maximum virtualization, you license the entire physical server, so you license the entire host, right, that's running your hypervisor software, and you license it with Enterprise Edition core licenses and cover those licenses with software assurance. Okay, now if you want to license a virtual machine using the per core licensing model, you license the virtual cores in the VM, and again there's that minimum 4-core license requirement for each VM. If you're using standard edition, you're going to license the virtual machine using server plus cal and use that licensing model. You license each virtual machine with a server license and then license the user or device with a client access license. Okay, and if you fully license all the hosts with SQL Server Enterprise Core licenses, and if you're covered by software assurance, going for the maximum virtualization route, you can deploy an unlimited number of virtual machines. SQL Server 2017 introduces the support for the deployment on containers. So we've spoken about licensing individual virtual machines. We've spoken about licensing for virtualization. This container technology that's reasonably new. SQL Server 2017 introduced support for deploying SQL Server to containers. And following this approach, it will allow Microsoft SQL Server customers to deploy SQL Server in containers using container technology like Docker. So what containers do, they provide operating system level virtualization that allows these multiple isolated applications to be run on a single operating system. So containers make it really easy to allow you to do things like rapid deployment. It gives you that separation of your application services through these micro deployments, and it allows you to scale up and scale down your application services really quickly. Now, containers differ from virtual machines in they provide the operating system, they provide virtualization at the operating system level. Right, so all containers running on a host share the same operating system. That can provide that application isolation, but it doesn't have that operating system level isolation that a virtual machine would have. So containers, they're less resource intensive, they require much less overhead to run, and they can be started, they can be scaled up rapidly, and they give you that high degree of portability. Now virtual machines, they give, in contrast, a virtual machine gives you that hardware level virtualization where each VM's got its own operating system environment, it's got its own memory, it's got its own cores, and that gives full isolation from other virtual machines, and you can make changes to unique settings for each operating system running on the VM. But from a licensing perspective, an operating system environment is defined as all or part of an operating system instance or all or part of a virtual operating system instance which enables separate virtual machine identity. Now, containers and virtual machines are structured differently, but they're considered the same from a licensing perspective. So, as an example, if you're using a container with 6 cores, with Enterprise Edition SQL Server, you need a 6-core license to cover the container. So as I said, although containers and virtual machines are not the same thing, from a licensing perspective they're treated the same way. So you can license individual containers using a per core licensing model. You license the virtual cores in each container with a minimum of a 4-core license required for each. So if you look at the examples we've got on the screen here, we have got 3 containers running 2, 4 and 6 cores respectively. So that's a total of 12 cores. But we need 14 cores to license this situation. Okay, and we need that because of the minimum 4-core requirement. You have to have a minimum of 4-core licenses. So the container with 2 cores is still going to need that 4-core license. If you're using standard edition, server plus cal comes into play as well. So you license each container with the server license and then license each user or device with a client access license. Alright, so in the example here, we've got 2 containers, one with two processors and one with 4. The number of cores are irrelevant because we're licensing with a server plus cal. Alright, so we need a server license for each container, and then we need a client access license for each user or device. So we need 3 cals. You can license for maximum density when you're licensing containers as well. So if we've got 2 hosts with 2 processors, each with 6 cores, we need to license 2 sets of 6 cores, which gives us a 12-core license to cover all the cores. Okay, so we fully licensed the SQL Server 2017 or above Enterprise Edition with core licenses and software assurance. We can deploy an unlimited number of containers. If you don't have software assurance, you are limited to 12 instances. And we also have to mention big data clusters. Right? In SQL Server 2019, big data clusters, they're a new feature. Now, these big data clusters, they allow you to have your relational databases and your big data solutions all in one place, which will allow you allowing you to do your analytics and your processing all from the same data platform. So it's allowing you to build up your SQL Server environment and surround it with perhaps some of the NoSQL or non-relational data stores that you might be utilizing. Now, if you want to license a SQL Server 2019 big data cluster, it comes in two components. There's the master SQL instance and there's the big data nodes, and both components must be licensed. Okay, so the server that's running the SQL Server master instance, the big data cluster master instance, must be assigned an appropriate number of SQL Server 2019 either enterprise or standard edition core licenses. And then the SQL Server big data nodes, these are the servers used for big data nodes. They must be licensed using a SQL Server big data node core license as well. Now, additionally, as a software assurance benefit, big data nodes as a core entitlement will provide you with a limited number of big data node cores at no additional cost. So it gets thrown in with your software assurance licensing. Now, if you've got larger deployments and they're larger than your software assurance benefit, the servers used for the additional big data node cores must be licensed with SQL Server big data node big data node cores. So SQL Server 2019 big data clusters with Enterprise Edition as a master will get 8 times the master instance cores as big data node cores as part of the software assurance entitlement. If you're using SQL Server 2019 big data clusters standard edition as master instance, it gets the same number of big data node core licenses as the number of licenses for the master instance for the big data node cores as part of software assurance. It's important to note when you're using big data clusters, you can't use server plus cal licenses for the big data cluster master instance. If you want to make use of the license flexibility that Microsoft offer, you're really probably going to need software assurance with your SQL Server licenses. Now, there are a number of benefits that you can get with software assurance, and these were available in SQL Server 2017, and they have changed for SQL Server 2019. And these changes were released for SQL Server 2019 as it was released to market in November of that year. So if you're following an unlimited virtualization or you're using unlimited virtualization, that will allow you to use your SQL Server and run any number of instances of SQL Server Enterprise Edition in an unlimited number of virtual machines where you have licensed all the cores in the underlying hosts. Failover servers allow customers to install and run passive SQL Server instances in a separate operating system environment for high availability in anticipation of a failover event. You can get Power BI Report Server. Right, so if you're a SQL Server Enterprise Edition customer, you can run Power BI Report Server. There's Machine Learning Server for Hadoop. Again, if you're an Enterprise Edition customer of Microsoft, you can run Machine Learning Server for Hadoop. License mobility is an interesting one. If you've got license mobility within your server farm, you can reassign your SQL Server licenses within that farm more than once per 90 days. If you don't have software assurance, you are limited to doing it once per 90 days. So if you want to make use of things like live migration or vMotion, depending on the hypervisor of choice, then you're probably really going to need to have that license mobility. So you really need software assurance. Also, if you've got software assurance and you get license mobility, you can reassign your SQL Server licenses to a third party, like a cloud provider, for example. You have disaster recovery rights, so it allows backup instances of SQL Server and it allows you to use those for temporary use if you're in a disaster recovery situation. Now, there are some additional benefits that customers can use in addition to these benefits. So if you're part of the server cloud enrollment, you're an SCE customer of Microsoft, you can qualify for things like premium benefits, including unlimited problem resolution support. Now, the software assurance benefits, they were amended in November 2019, coinciding with the release of SQL Server 2019, and we will talk more about those changes later, because they are actually quite important. And going back to our old Brewery case study and story, it would potentially have an impact for those guys too. So if your SQL servers are covered by software assurance, you get hybrid cloud benefits. So an Azure hybrid benefit for SQL Server, it's an Azure based benefit that will enable you to use your SQL Server licenses, as long as they're covered by software assurance, to pay a reduced base rate on SQL resources in Azure. Right? So you can get discounts on things like managed instances, or if you're using vCore based Azure SQL database, or Azure database in an elastic pool, or even on SQL Server virtual machines running in Azure. So this hybrid benefit, it gives you the ability to move your licenses to a fully managed platform as a service product. You get 4 cores in the cloud for every one on-premises core that you have for Enterprise Edition. Okay, and you get 180 days of dual use rights, so you can apply into a current deployment. So if you've got a third party or an on-premises server, you can run side by side in Azure to allow you to do your data migration, and you get 180 days to do that. So that can be really useful for having that parallel running for a time as you're getting your migration done and your migration in order. As I mentioned a slide or so back, there were significant changes to the software assurance benefits for SQL Server 2019, and they were announced in November 2019 when SQL Server 2019 was released to market. So the big data nodes and the core entitlement, it gives customers a limited big data node core entitlement for their big data cluster. But also alongside that, and we've touched on that already, every software assurance customer will basically got 3 benefits for any version of SQL Server that they were currently using that was covered by software assurance. So it was in support, so it had to be SQL Server 2012 or later, and covered by software assurance. And they were failover servers for high availability. Now, Microsoft would allow their customers to install and run passive SQL Server instances in a separate operating system environment. Right? Or they could have a server for high availability on premises in anticipation for that failover event. But with the changes in and that was prior to the changes in November 2019. Software assurance customers of Microsoft would have 1 free passive instance for high availability. But they introduced a couple of other benefits as well. So you can have failovers for disaster recovery. This is a new benefit introduced in 2019. And that allows customers of Microsoft and SQL Server to install and run a passive SQL Server instance in a separate operating system environment, either on premises or on premises for disaster recovery, again in anticipation of a failover event. And then there was failover servers for disaster recovery in Azure, and that allows customers to install and run a passive SQL Server instance in a separate operating system environment for disaster recovery in Azure, again in anticipation of a failover event. There were some other changes too that would allow you to offload some of the sort of DBA, the database administration type tasks, to the secondaries that actually meant you didn't need a license for those secondary servers. So previously, you were not able to carry out operations such as backups or consistency checks on the databases on the secondary that was being used for high availability unless you had a license for that secondary server. The changes introduced in November 2019 mean you can carry out certain operations and certain admin tasks such as consistency checks or log backups or full backups or monitoring resource usage on the secondary without having to have a license for that secondary. You can offload some of that workload, some of that administrative workload to those passive replicas and not need a license for it. We're going to look at certain licensing scenarios here that we can apply to our old Brewery case study. Okay, we're going to look at things like how we can license for high availability, why we might want to consider application mobility, and how we can go about licensing our non-production environments. And if we take those specific scenarios and apply it to the case study that we're using in this course, the old Brewery, and several others, we can see that if we get the architecture right for these situations and we get the setup right, making use of some of those new software as assurance benefits introduced in November 2019 can allow us to save some considerable money on our SQL Server licenses. So let's have a look at each of those scenarios. We know SQL Server can be configured and set up for high availability and disaster recovery in mind. So if one server fails, the processing of that server is picked up by another node. Now, all editions of SQL Server on Windows provide basic high availability features. So we've got things like log shipping. We have basic availability groups which are available in Standard Edition, along with 2-node failover clustering. And then if we look at Enterprise Edition, there's all the advanced features available in this. So there's the full set of availability groups, multi-node SQL Server clusters. You can have, going back to the availability groups, you can have active readable secondaries. It supports multi-site and multi-subnet failover. There's a lot of features in SQL Server that you can use to keep your data platform up and running and highly available, and allow you to hit the various SLAs that you may have in place for your systems. And when it comes to licensing that environment, it's good to have an understanding of what is available to you and how much it's going to cost. So when we're configuring our SQL Server for high availability and disaster recovery, we need to consider the licensing. And for our high availability and disaster recovery solutions to be effective, and for SQL Server to be able to cope with a certain amount of failures, you need to have an element or quite a considerable amount of redundancy built into the system. Now, that redundancy can take the form of other machines, be it physical or virtual, that are set up to run the workload should the primary server fail. And it's how you go about licensing these redundancy virtual machines. How do you approach that? Now, there are some strict rules on how these get licensed and what you have to pay for. Now, the changes back in November 2019, they relaxed the rules a little bit, and in doing so you can actually save some money on licenses with doing very little at all. So if you look at the scenario on screen, in the situation there, under the old licensing rules, that you would pay a different amount compared to with the new benefit. So with the situation we've got on screen, the primary replica or the active replica has got 12 cores. The high availability and disaster recovery solution has got 2 secondary replicas built in. One is configured with synchronous replication for high availability, supporting the automatic failover, and the other one is an asynchronous replica that's going to be used for disaster recovery without automatic failover. Okay, now under the old software assurance rules, the disaster recovery site would need a license. Okay, so we would have to have paid for 24 of licensed 24 cores. With the new software assurance benefits introduced for SQL Server 2019, under those new benefits, the number of SQL Server core licenses required to operate this configuration would only be 12, as opposed to the 24 it would have been in the past. So you can see there's quite a considerable saving on those core licenses. It's quite important just to stress here, though, that both the high availability and the disaster recovery node, they would have to be passive. That is, you can't do reads against those secondary instances running on those nodes. The moment you start querying data from those databases, it becomes there's a need then to license that environment. But with this environment, if both are passive, one is for high availability, one is disaster recovery, and they're sat there waiting to take over, you only need to license the 12 cores in the primary replica. License mobility and license for application mobility is particularly pertinent if you're running SQL Server in a virtual environment like old Brewery are in our scenario. So what license mobility is, it's a right that is available for all editions of SQL Server and SQL Server licensing, as long as they are covered by an active software assurance agreement. Now, with the application mobility or the license mobility benefit, you're able to reassign your SQL Server licenses to different servers within the farm as often as needed, right? And you can assign them to third parties as well. So if you think about it for a second, if you're running on a virtual machine and you want to do some load balancing across different hosts, so you spread your SQL Server workload across different hosts in your hypervisor environment, you can do so. You can live migrate, you can vMotion these machines across, as long as you've got this application mobility, because the license will follow the virtual machine. So when it moves, those licenses that you're using for the VM will move with the virtual machine, and you can do that as often as you want to. If you don't have that, then moving those machines, you're restricted to 90 days, so it doesn't let you vMotion and make use of all those good benefits that the hypervisor brings. But you can reassign your licenses to third parties as well. Okay, so for example, if you wanted to do a cloud migration, for example, and you were looking to take your licenses with you, you can reassign them to that third party and third party shared servers. So this license mobility is available under both the per core and the server plus cal licensing models. Right, now, if your licenses are not covered with an active software assurance agreement, they can only be reassigned to a different server within the farm once every 90 days. Right, and you can't reassign them to a third-party web host or public cloud at any time. Okay, now there are some things Microsoft will. So if you get a permanent hardware failure, for example, the 90-day reassignment limit is waived. So all SQL Server licenses with an active software assurance agreement can be reassigned to another server within the farm as often as needed. They can only be reassigned to another server in another farm or to a non-private cloud once every 90 days. Now, a server farm can consist of up to 2 data centers located in time zones within 4 hours of one another, or within the European Union or the European Free Trade Association. Okay, and a given data center may only be part of one server farm. But this license mobility benefit can really help customers who perhaps license individual machines or containers and then want to reassign those licenses to different servers within the server farm, right? Allowing you to move your workloads dynamically if you're using some of the cool features of your hypervisor to load balance across different hosts, or if you're going to move to a cloud environment. So another area where you can look to make some savings is in a situation where you've got non-production SQL Server environments, and everybody's got them, right? We've all got a sort of dev and a UAT and perhaps another test type environment. Now, customers and Microsoft SQL Server users, you are required to license every Microsoft product you install, configure and use, whether it's physical or virtual. All right, and then if you think about applying that to a development and test environment, it can work out really expensive. So if we go back to the old Brewery case study where they've licensed their hosts and they've got their production, their dev and their test servers all running across those hosts, all using those licenses. Licensing that development and test environment, it can be expensive and it can be a challenge to manage as you're more likely to spin up and tear down test and development servers as they're required. Now, Microsoft appreciate this and they offer a few cost-effective options for licensing SQL Server for use in non-production environments. And if you get this right, it can really help with your license bill. Okay, now I touched on this earlier on, SQL Server Developer Edition. Now that being SQL Server Developer Edition, it's a fully featured version of SQL Server. It's got all the features and capabilities of Enterprise Edition, but it's licensed for development, test and demonstration purposes. So you can't use it in a production environment, and you can't use it with production data, but you can install and run SQL Server Developer Edition on any number of devices. Now this is significant because it allows you to run the software on many different devices for testing purposes without having to license each non-production server system. So a production environment is defined as an environment that is accessed by end users of the application, such as an internet website, that is used for more than gathering feedback or acceptance testing of that application. Okay, so what constitutes a production environment? Well, environments that connect to a production database, environments that support disaster recovery or backup for a production environment, or environments that are used for production at least some of the time, such as a server that is rotated in and out of production during peak workloads of activity. Right, now Microsoft consider it rare for someone whose primary role is designing, developing or testing software would qualify as an end user of that software. Okay, and Developer Edition, the license is free. So how much do licenses cost? We've looked at how we can license for high availability, we've looked at license mobility, and we've also looked at licensing a non-production environment. We've looked at Server plus Cal, we've spoken about that, we've talked about per core. But how much do these things cost? All right, and so this is what we're going to look at on this slide here. Mr. Fox has reappeared as well with his van to sell us our licenses in packs of 2. Now what's quoted on the screen, these are the recommended retail prices that I've got off the Microsoft website. To get your price that you're actually going to pay, you need to talk to your license provider. Okay. Now Enterprise Edition, a 2-core pack of Enterprise Edition comes in at around about $14,256, which equates to just over £11,000. Right. Standard Edition, a 2-core pack for Standard Edition is around $3,700, which equates to about £2,875. Okay, now consider you need 4, so you need to times that by 2, but we'll get to that in just a second. If you're going for Server plus Cal, the server license is around $930, which equates to about £720, and then each Cal comes in at $209 or £162. And then the software assurance cost, which you're probably going to need, it comes in at roughly 30% of your licensing costs per 3-year period. So I think that software assurance is a necessary cost, just because of particularly if you're running in a virtual environment, the application mobility, but also because of all the nice benefits you get around high availability and disaster recovery. And if you've got passive high availability nodes and disaster recovery nodes, they no longer need a license. But at a minimum, if you wanted an Enterprise Edition SQL Server, right, you're going to need at least 4 cores. That's going to come to around about £22,000. Right? And to get the full benefit of the high availability and disaster recovery, the license mobility, you need to add on that 30%, which comes in at around about £28,000. So it's not cheap. Okay, and that's obviously using just a 4-core server. Some of our servers can have a lot more cores than that. If we use the example from earlier on, where we had a 12-core in our primary node, under the old rules we'd have needed 24 core licenses plus software assurance to run that configuration, right, which comes to around about $213,000 under the old rules. Under the new rules with software assurance, it comes to around $106,000. So that's a significant saving without you actually having to do anything.
So how can you save some money? The key to saving money with your SQL Server licensing boils down to answering a couple of questions. You need to choose the correct edition for your environment, and in order to do that, you need to be able to answer questions like, are we licensing for production? If it's not a production environment, can we use Developer Edition? It's free after all, right? Are we using or do we need any of the Enterprise Edition features? So, do we need high availability and disaster recovery? If we're using some of those features, could we use the HADR features that are in Standard Edition? Okay, we can have a failover cluster instance. We can have a basic availability group in Standard Edition. Do we need Enterprise Edition, or will Standard suffice? Right, and only use Enterprise Edition where you absolutely need it. The other way you can save money on your SQL Server licenses is to consolidate. Consolidate your SQL servers, and to do that you need a good understanding of your SQL Server's workload. So assume that you're licensing calls, right? Know your workload, know your capacity, know what you're using. Now, when I started out as a database administrator many moons ago, I wanted my SQL Server to be used as little as possible. I wanted CPU utilization to be as close to zero as I could get it. Now, these days though, in order to get the most out of my licenses, and the way the license model has changed means I need to change my mindset. I now need to squeeze every last cycle out of my CPUs in terms of compute resources. Right? And if I scale up on my CPUs, my licensing cost goes up. Now, if I'm using Standard Edition, choose the most effective licensing model. Right? If you've got a small number of users and devices, Server plus Cal can be the most effective way to license. Just be aware that as the number of devices and users increases and grows, it can quickly be more efficient to use the per core model. Now, if we bring this back to our case study and the story of the old brewery, we could quite easily reduce the number of cores they are using, right, without actually changing the number of instances, without changing editions. We could just license individual machines instead of licensing each host. Now, granted, that would take away their ability to add extra VMs, but they're not at that stage where they're saturating those boxes. So they could go from 96 cores down to 24, license it with software assurance. They can stay as is, and it's going to cost them it'll be north of £500,000 on their licensing fees just by consolidating and simplifying and licensing virtual machines. They can get that down to 174,000, which is like a 68% reduction. So Chelsea, the CEO there, is going to be going, okay, well, we've now got our licensing fee down, so we're getting some significant work. It's driving our business critical applications. Some of the new features in 2012 mean I can do some of this analytic stuff that allows me to keep up with the cool cats and the new breweries that are taking our trend, and we can start using our data to make better products and make decisions business decisions based on our data, and help us catch up with the new kids on the block that have caught us up. So we get to make that saving, and then by modernising and moving to the new platform, we can do some of the cool, funky analytic stuff too. So there's a nice, easy way for Old Brewery to make savings there. So we've seen the example of Old Brewery. We've now got a couple of other real life scenarios where we've looked to make our customers savings by getting their licensing position correct. So for a financial body, we've reduced the number of calls they're using per core licensing from 46 down to 34. We reduced the number of SQL Server instances from 20 down to 9. They had older versions of SQL Server across different editions as well. We got that down to two editions, and in doing all this, we were able to well, if they stayed as was, their licensing position would have been a cost us at around about £94,000. By consolidating and simplifying, we got that down to just about £51,000, which is a 47%
47% reduction, and we were able to improve things like availability and stuff too. And the last example I'm gonna talk about is a household retailer. They had some performance issues with an availability group that they were using to offer up DR. They didn't have dedicated servers. But what we did, we came in, we looked at the features they were using. They weren't really making use of any of the Enterprise Edition features, and they didn't really need them. So by removing Enterprise Edition and migrating to a later version but on Standard Edition, we simplified their operation. Performance was improved and unaffected. And if they'd have stayed as they were, their licensing costs would have been 164,000. By consolidating, simplifying, and removing Enterprise Edition, we got that down to £52,000, which is quite a big reduction, around about 69%. No doubt we'll be taking questions now at the end of the session, but I do get asked a few questions as I'm going along. So one of the most common questions is, and we've touched on it a little bit, is what constitutes production? So a production environment is defined that's an environment that's accessed by end users. Right? They might be your website, they might be an application, or whatever. Right? And that environment is used for more than gathering feedback or the acceptance testing of an application. Okay. There are certain scenarios which would constitute a production environment. So anything that connects, if an environment connects to a production database, is considered production, or if it supports disaster recovery or is backup for a production environment, then that would constitute a production environment too. If an environment is used for production at least some of the time, so maybe you're rotating a server in and out during peak periods of activity, again, that would constitute production. But if you're designing, developing and testing software, right, it's unlikely you would qualify as an end user. So in those cases, perhaps using developer edition can be useful for you. So that brings us to the end of the talk. We've looked at Old Brewery, we've looked at how we can potentially make some savings on the SQL Server licensing position, and we've looked at some of the new features in 2019 that Old Brewery could use to introduce data-driven decisions into their business. We've also looked at the various different editions of SQL Server you need to license. We've spoken about software assurance and why you probably need both. We've spoken about the different licensing models, the per core and the server plus cal. We've spoken about licensing in a virtual environment, and we've covered a lot of licensing scenarios as well. We've spoken about high availability and application and license mobility and non-production and licensing non-production SQL servers. And when we've worked through our scenario, we've seen how Old Brewery can make savings on cost, but also develop a data platform that's going to be fit for purpose for them going forward. So all that leaves me to do is to thank you for coming. I'll be around for a while to answer any questions you have. If you want to drop my email down, you can drop me an email at any time if you've got any questions you think I can answer. It's Gethyn@gethynellis.com. But thank you for coming and thank you for watching my session.